Hello everyone, this is Craig Peters here from Soundiron, and on today's Soundiron podcast, we talk with Misha Mansoor, who's the guitarist and founding member of the progressive metal band Periphery. And during our conversation, he talks a little bit about how he approaches business opportunities, his workflow in using Cubase, tips and tricks, some up-and-coming projects, and much, much more, so stick around. All right, so I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about at first was, because you're definitely someone who likes to stay busy, it seems, and you have your hand in a lot of really exciting projects and stuff. And I just wanted to ask, how have you always been like a very entrepreneurial type person, or is that something that like since you were younger you've been that way, or sort of as you got in a band and started doing more stuff with that?
I think it's one of those things that I never thought about. You just are the way that you are, and you just look at things a certain way. I think I've appreciated maybe in my later years, like the fact, maybe in hindsight, that I'm entrepreneurial, but it just felt like sort of a logical. It's just the way I kind of like looked at the world and opportunities. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of the entrepreneurial people that I've met and that I know are kind of the same way. There wasn't ever really like a decision like I'm going to be entrepreneurial about this or whatever. It's just that was the way that they looked at the world, and the way that they saw opportunities. It's like when something came in front of them, a lot of people would look at it this way, and I would look at it a different way, like, oh, we could do this with that. And I think the other thing is I always wanted to be, well, not always, but like when I was like 14 or so, I wanted to be a musician. And then you had the dream of starting a band, going on the road, et cetera, et cetera. And I think with that, my parents were not thrilled about the idea that I was dropping out of school to pursue music, but it was what was making me happy. And it's something I knew I needed to pursue. So they said, look, like, we'll support your decision to do that as long as you're responsible about this. Like, you need to know what you're getting into. And I really took that to heart. Like, I tried to learn as much as possible. I saw that a lot of younger bands were making mistakes with their contracts just out of sheer excitement, or the fact that they didn't really know, what was going on or what to look out for. So I asked a lot of our peers and bands and people that had experience for advice. And for things to look out for. And I think I've just always had that sort of inquisitive mind about that. I'd like to be as best prepared for the scenario that I'm about to jump into. So, I don't know if that gives you some context of what I'm talking about. I don't know if that's seen as entrepreneurial or not there. But I think it's just having that sense of like looking at it from that scope rather than sort of jumping in and just seeing what happens,
Yeah, definitely. I think, looking around and seeing what other people are doing and always just trying to have sort of not just a wing it mentality, I think.
Right. Yeah, I don't really like to wing things when it comes to business, Maybe when it comes to figuring out a new piece of gear, yeah. I'm not the biggest fan of reading the manual. But on things that can severely affect your chance of success and the outcome of certain situations, there I like to be a bit more meticulous and prepared.
Yeah, definitely. As far as like other stuff, that you've done with Periphery, you do a lot of stuff with gear companies and, definitely a lot of different stuff gear related. And I've seen that you've been working with Peavey on the Invective head and cab. And I was like wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, about kind of how that came about. I mean,
that was just sort of an opportunity that came to me. It was like, the idea was that I felt that I could design a pretty cool amp, and I felt that Peavey was a good company to do that with. Since, the 5150/6505 archetype is just a very pleasing amp, and it's a very appropriate amp for metal and for rock, and especially if you're recording. So I went to them and kind of discussed it, and it's something that they were interested in. And I think generally, like, the idea was like, I think that there's a lot that's good about that amp. I think there's a lot that really could be improved or completely changed. And that was like sort of the general approach. It sort of morphed into a thing of its own, to be fair. Because I think maybe some people have seen it sort of as some sort of 6505 version 2, which, you know, would really be selling it very short.
Yeah.
So even if that was sort of the impetus of starting the process, like it kind of evolved into its own thing. But I've said this every time, I'll say it again. You know, if you ever get the opportunity to design an amp with someone, you say yes. You know, that's
especially
a fascinating process. Yeah, it's a fascinating process. And the engineer that I worked with there, John Fields, is just he's so damn good at what he does. And so the whole process was just a lot of fun. It was a really fun process.
Yeah, I would think especially just if you're into that sort of thing, that, you know, someone saying, hey, do you want to learn more about it and develop something that of course you'd be like, oh, like, hell yeah, I'm going to jump on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you're not a gear nerd like me, then maybe the answer is no. But for me, that was like pretty much exactly what I wanted to hear. So yeah, I went for it. And the amp that we designed, I mean, it took like 3 years to design the amp, but the amp that we designed is just incredible. Like I really surpassed my expectations of what I thought we'd be able to do or get away with. So I'm really, really glad that we did that, if anything, just because I've got this sort of dream amp now sitting right behind me.
Yeah, I would think like having an amp that, you know, it's kind of like you know, with the stuff you guys did with Getgood drums, just being able to like now we have our own drum samples. We don't have to go anywhere else. It's, you know, because I know before you guys used a lot of Superior drummer. And now it's like, well, yeah, we have our own, you know, drum samples, you know, that our drummer uses. So it just makes everything that much more your own and that much more fun, I think, when you start doing pre-production and writing and just having your own sounds that you get, you know, stoked about.
Absolutely. And it's experimentation. I think part of it, like with Getgood drums, is to quote the golden era of Top Gear, is how hard could this be? You know, how hard could it be to put our own sample library? We have all the pieces that we need. We have all the tools. We think we have the knowledge. So are we missing something? And it was sort of an experiment. Let's see what happens if we, you know, go and try to create our own drum library and what happens.
Yeah.
And I think we were just as ready for it to be like, oh, this is a colossal failure because we completely underestimated the work or how things would translate in the context of a drum library. But it ended up being the opposite. You know, it ended up being this thing that for us personally was a success. And it was, for me, I was just like, it's so awesome to have my drummer Matt,
yeah,
you know, just ready to go. I mean, he's gonna be playing these parts anyway. So for me, and the sounds that we both like, you know, it's just very much like you have your own bespoke drum library. Well, yeah, why wouldn't you want to do that? But then as it turns out, it was something that other people really enjoyed too, and it did quite well for us, and continues to do so.
That's awesome.
But it really just started out as like an interesting experiment / passion project because we're just a bunch of nerds.
Yeah, well, I think it's cool because it's like you sort of have everything laid out. You have, you know, an awesome drummer. You know, Nolly has a great ear for production, and, you know, seems like he's
Absolutely.
very meticulous when it comes to, you know, the recording process and just always trying to.
He's the most meticulous guy you'll ever meet. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, it seems like it.
You know, he's. But even more than that, because I feel like usually you fall into this category of people who are extremely meticulous, but then sort of have a robotic aesthetic as a result because everything must be just so. Mm-hmm. And then you have people who just follow their ear, but then it's sort of like more art than it is science. And Nolly manages to straddle this line so perfectly between, you know, really being meticulous and understanding what he wants, but also having just one of the most astonishing ears I've ever heard. So he knows how to listen and what to listen for, and it allows him to sort of use the best of both sides, to where the scientific side and the meticulous side can sort of inform the artistic side on how to achieve the best result. And it's a real gift. It's the reason why I recognize I couldn't ever mix at the level that he does or engineer at the level that he does, because it really is a gift.
Yeah, I think I saw in an interview somewhere that you actually started showing Nolly stuff at first, right? As far as mixing goes.
Yeah, I mean, at first, because, you know, and I'm not the read the manual type, so I had a sort of painstaking process, and it was very much not by the book. There's a lot of stuff I was doing that was just plain wrong, but that just sort of functioned at best. I've never considered myself to be good at mixing. It was just a means to an end. I really like composition and production and things like that, but and writing, but mixing was just a means to get something that was decent. And at first, not only was coming to me for tips, and then, you know, not even a couple months later, he was teaching me how to mix. So that's really a gift that he has. It's something that came extremely naturally to him with his sort of personality type. And that's why I think that's a large part why, you know, the Getgood drum samples came out the way they did.
Yeah. Also, too, I saw that you guys have been teasing a little bit about some work with JST and doing an amp sim. Can you talk about that at all? Or?
Oh yeah, I just dropped that. Well, I can't talk too much. I mean, I'm supposed to be remaining somewhat tight-lipped, but I think, you know, there's quite a bit of information out there just by virtue of that video being out. But
yeah, got everyone, I'm sure, all riled up.
I mean, again, it's like, you know, Joey's an awesome dude. I love his plugins, and, you know, we kind of connected, and he was like, hey, well, would you ever be interested in doing a software amp? And I was like, yeah, of course I would. And more so because, you know, the thing is, like, I'll only ever like software amps. I haven't really loved them, and I think going in, I was like, this is the challenge, you know? Yeah. And I think he saw that as a challenge. And I thought his amps were really cool. They felt really good, like what they were going for. What I go for is so specific that obviously wouldn't necessarily fall into that aesthetic. But I was very impressed with the feel, because I feel like that's where a lot of the software amps fall short. They'll be sort of fantastic for reamping. Like I'm a big fan of TSE X50, which I think is just a fantastic and a big surprise. It's a 5150 model, you know, but I think they did an absolutely fantastic job making it sound great. I've used it on like final mixes for bands I've mixed, and it sounds wonderful, but it doesn't feel very good to play on. Like, it's really better suited for reamping, you know, in the context of a mix. And this was a challenge. I was like, well, you know, I know that there are plugins out there that can sound good, and I know that Joey's plugins feel good. So I was like, look, like, this is something I'd like to see if we can crack, is sort of make the best sounding, best feeling software plugin. And you know, here we are a couple of years later, and I'm still getting. I mean, these are still beta versions, so there's a few kinks that need to be worked out. But man, even that first one blew me away. The first, and this version that I posted the video of is a few iterations in, but just the first one, which didn't sound as good as this one, I was already like, okay, like this is real.
Like now we're getting
this
somewhere.
Can happen now. Oh, absolutely. I don't know what those guys are doing, what black magic they're working with over there, but they seem to have cracked something. And this one just sounds very much like me, which is kind of crazy. Like, it shows that he really gets what it is that I'm going for, which ultimately is like, that's the real thing. It's like we're you know, you're in this industry too, you know, like we're talking about sounds through abstractions, you know, like, oh, it needs more bite, it needs more attack. Like, what does that mean? That means 10 different things to 10 different people. So when you can communicate with someone and they actually understand, my God, that saves you so much time and trouble. And that's why even the first beta was like, oh, he nailed it, you know? So I can't talk too much about the features and the details. He's definitely, I'll say that they have gone like overboard with the features. Like, this thing is going to be able to do everything. It's like, I kind of made a wish list and they were like, okay, to everything. So that's great. I love feature pack things, but it's actually like deceivingly simple too, because I think a lot of people don't want to be overwhelmed by whatever the plugin is, and we found that with GGD and Horizon as well, that like people most of our customers want things that are relatively simple, you know. Maybe Soundiron finds things a little bit different, because I imagine you guys cater to like composers and people who sort of go under the hood, and I'm one of those people. Like, I like pretty in-depth stuff, but I know for a lot of people that could be so intimidating that they'll actually just not want to use the product.
I think one of the things that's always like finding that middle ground of, you know, because you get some people that are like, you know, I just want to open it up, plug and play, and just get going and start, you know, working on whatever you're working on. But then, you know, you have some people that they want to really tweak stuff. And I think, you know, some companies have that option where they can do both, and then some companies have it where it's just like kind of one or the other, and it can
Right.
be sort of the deciding factor of what makes people want to use it.
Well, like for example, when I was using TuneTrack, like I always loved Superior, but they didn't really have a lot of Superior libraries coming out. It was always Easy Drummer, which I was not the biggest fan of with Easy Drummer, because Easy Drummer had sort of a finished sound, but you couldn't really impart your own character onto it. They were kind of done. It was like what you get, right? But Easy Drummer is literally what made that brand, because that's what 90% of customers wanted. So I guess I recognized in that moment that I am not the majority of the customers, and I have to sort of, change my perspective on the products and how we make these things. Because if it were up to me, I'd put everything in the kitchen sink in it. But most people would actively dislike that.
Yeah, it's like you give people too many options, they almost get overwhelmed. They don't even,
Yeah, option paralysis, and it's just, and then they just won't want to use it or buy it or whatever. So
yeah,
you kind of, again, it's learning from other people's experience and inputs.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people that sort of get into the home recording studio, building a home studio and just like having all this stuff, I would think a lot of people tend to sort of want to learn more. Like when I first got into it, it was like, I just want to be able to record my band stuff. It was like, all right, we need to record pre-production. It saves time and money. All right, cool, let's do it. And the more I started doing it, I just started realizing like, man, like I want it to sound good. And then you just start, researching how to mix and how to, stuff that I'm never going to be a mastering guy, but, like basics of mastering, just, to make your creations sound that much better. And, it's like anything, you could just spiral down the wormhole and just
absolutely
get lost in it.
No, absolutely. And that's pretty much how I got started as well, was like you kind of dip your toes in the water. And then it'll either be like kind of, oh, this is good enough, or I need to know everything about the, like you'll just fall down that rabbit hole. So, but I think that I assume that everyone was sort of in that latter category, and it turns out that a lot of people are quite content with having something that just works well enough, because the goal isn't necessarily to have the best sounding mix in the world. It's to get the creative ideas out as sort of effortlessly as possible,
Yeah. So you do a lot of stuff with orchestral stuff too, like on your YouTube channel. You do like, some walkthroughs of, some orchestral compositions and stuff. And, me personally, I can definitely relate to that, because it's just like coming from more of just like the metal background, but always loving orchestral music, film scores, video game composer music and stuff. Like growing up, like I always loved the music for Final Fantasy, just playing the video games. But I was never a music, like I liked music, but I wasn't like, I want to, be a composer or play guitar. I just, for some reason, always just had a love for the music. I would listen to the CDs and stuff. And I noticed you're a big Final Fantasy buff too. And you've done some mock-ups and stuff. And sort of like who are some of the other composers that got you into that style and wanting to compose orchestral mock-ups and that sort of thing?
It's interesting. This is an interesting question, because I think I've always been exposed to classical music, probably what I'd call like pop classical music, like the big guys, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Tchaikovsky, like all the guys that like would get kind of thrown in, if you had like a classical music compilation CD,
Yeah.
and all that material. And I was kind of raised on that though, And so I'd always had like an appreciation for the style, the sort of moves that they do, and the aesthetic of it, But I think I always had a fascination with it, but I never felt like it was anything that was particularly accessible to me. I mean, we all know how expensive renting an orchestra can be.
Yeah.
And
thousands of dollars.
Right, and it's just like composing for that is just so overwhelming. It's like, I'm gonna compose for 80 instruments. Like what? Like I have enough trouble composing for 4 or 5. You know. So, but when I realized that computers had finally caught up to where you could get like these realistic mock-ups with software, that was like that kind of changed my life a little bit. But it was just this thing, and it was a very similar feeling. I've told people this, like, to when I first discovered I could record on my computer. Because then all of a sudden it was like, I don't have to rely on anyone else. Like, I can make music happen in my computer in my own time. And that's what I did. And it was like this whole world was open to me, and I just wanted to explore it. and I had no idea what I was doing, but that was the fun. Well, it was the exact same thing with the orchestral stuff. It was like, now there's this whole world that I didn't have access to, that I have full access to, and that if I work hard, and I hear people's mock-ups, I hear some mock-ups, I'm like, I would never be able to tell that this was not a real orchestra.
Yeah, it's getting really good nowadays.
That's the bar. And it's partially the libraries, it's partially some of these guys are just so talented at either performing or programming that I remember hearing this one guy, Andy Blaney, I think is his name, and he works for Spitfire, and he was doing these like John Williams-esque compositions. They're just nuts, just this atonality and whatever, and it just sounded so real, and I was like, this is beyond the software. This is just a guy. You give him anything and he'd probably make it, sound incredible, right? And that was what I also liked about it, is this is a skill that you're gonna have to work at and learn how to sort of turn to your advantage to make these realistic mock-ups. And so then, things like so I did like an orchestral mock-up of the Final Fantasy VII battle theme. But what I did was I took the MIDI from the original track as well as like some orchestral renditions that had been done, and I put them up there as reference tracks and tried to pick out everything by ear. And it was like a training exercise to learn how composers would use the different instruments and the different parts of the orchestra. How like something that seems like a line that's like one coherent line is actually spread as it ascends through 3 different sections, Yeah. Like little things like that, like this is how you'd use these woodwind instruments here, and it just helped me get a bit of a context rather than like sort of reading a manual about what you're supposed to do. It was like kind of a way of going around from another angle and looking at like how people did it and trying to pick it out by ear. I don't know theory, but I do have a strong ear, so that's like kind of what I rely on in these situations, and it was a lot of fun putting that together,
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to samples, it's almost like some composers talk about, you're writing for the sample, or are you writing for the orchestra? But I think like for most of us, who don't have the budget to hire a 80-piece orchestra or 120-piece orchestra or however many, it's like you have to develop the skill either for, because there's so much stuff that an orchestra can do other than like what some sample libraries can provide. How do you go about doing that when you have the sample libraries? So it's like, but yeah, picking out an orchestra, kind of like what you did, I think it's great.
Yeah.
And I think it's like one of the things that probably a lot of composers should do more often to really understand how it works, because you can listen to it and it's some of the music like John Williams stuff is so dense that when you break it down, it's like almost there's one big melody that's spread across a whole orchestra. And it's insane just, what those guys do. And like when you really,
Right.
You can listen to that and be like, oh, like that's, that sounds really cool. And, I want to try to learn how to do that. But then when you really get into it, it's almost like, it's kind of like the recording thing. It could be super overwhelming.
Yeah, no. And I mean, looking at John Williams, like he's obviously got his themes that are very recognizable. And I'm like fascinated more by like what he does in like action or like tense scenes where there's just like atonality all over it. It seems to be breaking every rule. Like it's like it just if you were to listen to any one instrument, you'd be like, that's not musical,
Yeah.
But in context, it just creates this tension, and there's like arpeggiated just atonality going throughout everything. Nothing's matching up, and it just makes you feel tense when you hear it, and you're like, wow, that's incredible. And he composed that. He chose every note, like it's not just
with
like,
a piano,
go for it,
a piece
right?
of paper.
Right. And that stuff is just so fascinating to me. So I feel like I discovered this new world. And obviously a big part of that is finding sample libraries that not only sound good and realistic and have been captured well, but that also are fairly intuitive to use, because you don't want to be, again, I find that like everything that I want to do in my setup is just a balance between creativity and my workflow being tight enough that it doesn't sort of get in the way of the creativity. So if the whole time you're just trying to figure out how to get this damn, software plugin to sound good, then you're not writing,
Yeah. And
so you want to minimize that as
down.
much as possible. So those are the plugins I tend to gravitate towards, are the ones that sort of are easy to work with and intuitive to program and write with.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that you've used some of the Soundiron Olympus choirs on the last P3 album. Yep. Could you tell us sort of like how you used it and what you liked about it?
What I liked about it was I think the legatos sound really good, and I'm a sucker for good legato scripting. I thought the tonality was good. You know, the thing about Periphery is very dense. So there's some choirs that will sort of sound better in cleaner music, but you know, we needed something that can like cut through the mix a little bit better. Yeah. So I have a few choirs, but that was the one that seemed to work very well. And although we didn't end up using it on this, you know, the phrase creators always, I think those are clever. I think those are a lot of fun, actually. It makes that, I feel like that always adds a sense of realism. I don't think we used that anywhere in particular, but yeah, good legatos and good tone, appropriate tone, I should say, to cut through a mix. Very, very tough when you have distorted guitars. They just eat everything.
Yeah, I totally get you on that. Like, you know, some choirs sound good by themselves, but then once you put them into a dense mix or a mix that has a wall of distortion, they just disappear and there's nothing left.
There's nothing. It just literally takes up space in the mix and you don't hear it. So it is a bit about finding the right tool for the job. And that was pretty much the right tool for the job whenever we wanted a choir.
Awesome. When it comes to some of the, you know, you're doing your pre-production and the more symphonic stuff, is there any sort of plugins that you tend to use for, you know, mixing or reverbs or effects? Anything that you tend to like?
You know, it's interesting because I feel like I'm really learning a lot of stuff about that still. Like as much as I have my moves when it comes to metal, the interesting thing about rock and especially metal, and when you're working with distorted guitars, is so much of what you're doing is just mitigating disaster. You know, like you're working with very unfriendly frequencies, and you're just trying to get everything to work to some degree, if that makes sense. You know, and still get to sound big. Still, everything's fighting to cut through, and you're just so a lot of what you're doing is like trying to make it work first, and then focus on like getting it to sound good. It's a bit the opposite with the orchestral stuff because it all sounds great.
Yeah.
And it's more about getting it to coexist. So if you have different libraries recorded in different rooms, that's where like reverbs will come in, and like if you use the kind of same reverbs on the same instruments, then it'll make them sound more like they're in the same room.
Yeah.
But you can't go too crazy with it either, because they're such delicate sounds. Because they're such delicate sounds, they can like you're hearing such nuance, and the reverbs can just become overwhelming if you're not careful with it. You know, it could just be a wash, because in the context of like one section, be like, oh, that sounds great, and then before you know it, you have it on everything, and it's like, wow, this mix is just a complete mess right now. You know, so
yeah, you listen to everything by itself, and then you're like, oh, you know, this sounds great with all this reverb, right. And then as soon as you unsolo it, you're just like, what is going on?
Right. And it's kind of different in metal. Like, for example, if I put reverb on a snare drum and you were to hear it soloed, you'd be like, wow, you put that much reverb? It's like, yeah, you need that much reverb because it's cutting through like walls that distort guitars and bass, right? Yeah. And and in context, you'll just hear a little bit. And then with orchestral music, it's like everything just gets magnified because it's just, and generally speaking, very beautiful and rich sounds, you know?
Yeah.
So it's kind of learning to take a very subtle approach. Like every move needs to be very subtle. And I'm not using any crazy plugins because those crazier plugins, I feel like are in there to fix problems, if that makes sense, right? Yeah. So it's generally like EQ, reverb, and a bit of compression, and all sort of small moves. I've found that the lighter the hand I have with that stuff, the better. And just sort of like making sure you're managing your low end a lot because that stuff builds up really quickly, especially if you use a lot of reverb. I don't know. Maybe you've got some tips for me there because I'm not really an expert in those categories, but like that's just what I found is it takes a completely different approach.
Yeah, I think with any sort of mixing, what it really comes down to is like probably one of the best things I've ever learned when it comes to mixing is just subtractive EQ, like taking out the stuff you don't need. That's usually probably like
Right.
the first thing I'll ever do is like, okay, how much low end do I need? Okay, take out the rest, just, moves that, and not
Yeah.
drastic moves. Not usually the first thing people tend to do is just start boosting everything, boosting the highs, boosting the lows, and then they hear it by itself and they're like, yeah, this sounds awesome.
No, I mean that I think you kind of learn early on is not generally a good move. The only exception to that will be on my master bus where I'll tend to boost the highs. Do like a high shelf. That's part of a philosophy that Nolly taught me, which I'm kind of into, which is that most sounds are darker than you would expect them to be. So if you put it on the master bus, it should even them out. However, everything else is pretty much subtractive from there. Just remove what you don't need, and the idea being that whatever's left is the good stuff,
Yeah, that it's funny you mentioned that because I'm a big fan of a lot of the nail the mix stuff. And one of the things I learned from him was the top-down mixing and just,
Yeah.
And some people frown upon that. I think it's kind of one of those things that if you're going to do that anyway across everything, sort of, boosting some highs, boosting some lows, and then making smaller moves to individual instruments, it just kind of makes things a lot more easier. I think it kind of speeds up the process a lot more.
In the context of rock and metal too, like really the philosophy is that all your source tones, like pretty much any source tone that you think you're going to be capturing, will be darker than you expect it to be when you reference it against a professional mix, right? Guitar tone, drums, voice a lot of the time. I mean, unless you're running it through some crazy chain before you actually hit the computer. So as a result, you're going to end up, if you don't do that, you're going to end up with a very dark mix and not really understand why.
Yeah.
And rather than boosting it on every track, why not give yourself a bit of a head start by doing it on the master track, mastering top down? You're going to be going into a compressor. You're going to be going into a limiter.
Mm-hmm. So
mix into those things, because both of those things can severely affect how your mix sounds. So again, I sound like I'm justifying it as like it's the only way to do it, but it's not. Mix however you want to mix, and whatever works. But that is why that has always made sense for me, and to some degree that does translate still to if I'm doing orchestral stuff or electronic stuff. I still do kind of do that as well.
Awesome. When it comes to creativity, is there anything that you do to help maybe break writer's block, or something that you do to help you get out of a dry spell when it comes to writing?
I struggle with that a lot, especially in the winter. I find that the weather affects my creativity a lot, and I live on the East Coast, or this winter has been really brutal. It's been tough to be creative. If it's like gloomy outside, I don't feel like writing. If it's cold, I don't know. It just like bright sunny days always help a little bit, but yeah, I think the one thing I've learned is not to force it. Every time I've tried to force it, it's not been great. And then not beat yourself up, which I'm saying out loud now, but I probably still will. I probably still will beat myself up later.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to, especially when, you're in a professional band and you're sort of looked up to like, okay, keep the music coming because everyone's always wanting more and more music. You put out an album and then, a few months later, they're like, all right, where's the next one? And you're sort of like, people are just looking for you to just keep pumping out music all the time, and people don't realize it's like, hey, you have to like get into that creative space or want to write.
Absolutely.
You can't, like you said, you can't force it. And I feel like for me, a lot of times ideas come to me when I'm not even, in front of, my computer or like holding a guitar. Like I'll just be at the store somewhere and like a little rhythm pops in my head. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. And sort of like working it out in your head before you even get to a guitar. And then from there, you can sort of like, all right, cool. Now I can really expand on it.
That actually happens to me in the shower a lot, which is inconvenient, but I've definitely raced out of the shower before trying to commit an idea, and I'll be like working it out, drumming it out on myself, trying not to forget it in between the time I dry myself off and actually get to my computer. It does. Inspiration does tend to hit at interesting times. Sometimes when I'm driving as well. I guess it's in times where it's just sort of blank, where there's blank around you, because I'm usually not listening to music in the car either, because I'm weird. But when and the shower is like white noise, it's like maybe that's what clears your head out. So maybe there's some advice. But like, yeah, it's one of those things that also encourages me to write with the guys, because they are the best cures for a writer's block ever. Sometimes, I'll be stuck and then, I'll hear them do something and it'll be like, there we go. That's it, So they're coming over in a few days, actually, and we're going to be starting to write.
Oh, that's great.
For the new album, and I'm really excited about that, actually.
How's that coming along as far as the new album? Are you guys almost done?
Like we're starting our very first writing session for it in a few days.
Oh, awesome.
So it hasn't even begun yet. I mean, I'm always writing little ideas, and so are they, but this will be the first formal session, if you will, where we actually try to piece some stuff together and write together and see what happens,
So do you guys all just sort of write on your own and then get together and collaborate ideas?
Yeah, basically. And at this point, we can kind of trust that when we get together in a room, music will happen and it will be fun and effortless. So we don't even really worry about like what we're going to write and how it's going to come together. Like I have no idea what this new album is going to sound like. And to be honest with you, I haven't known what most of the other albums were going to sound like until we started writing it. We just kind of go with the flow. If it sounds good, great. If it doesn't, then try to fix it. If you can't fix it, then work on something else.
Yeah.
That's basically it. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, I think that's the exciting part about working on a new album, especially when you're a band like you guys, progressive band that, you don't try to write anything specific. It's kind of like whatever we want to write, that's what we're going to write.
Right.
And I think that's the fun part. Like when you're in a band that's sort of like there's some bands that are just known for having a certain style. And if they just modulate it any way, then people are just like, oh, I hate it. Oh, I like the last album better. And it's kind of like, it's kind of frustrating for bands because you're not the same person from, 5 years ago, 2 years ago. So it's like approaching every album from just like a fresh perspective, like, all right, cool, let's just see what happens. And I think it's the best way. And I think you get the best product in the end.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, I'm not trying to impress anybody with this. Like, this is a selfish pursuit for all of us. The only people I care about being happy are the other band members. Like outside of that, if our management doesn't like it, if our labels, well, now we are the label as of now, but in the past, if the label didn't like it, if management didn't like it, if the fans didn't get it, if whatever, like I didn't care, no one cared, because the whole reason I started this in the first place was because it's fun to write music, and I want music that's fun to write. I just want to have a good time making it. I probably won't even listen to it that much, like it's literally the experience of making it that's the most fun part, and then putting it out feels good because I believe in it. Even if it's badly received, I'll feel good about putting it out there because I that's how I'll feel.
Yeah, I think it's like when you spend so much time working on something, of course, like after you're done, you're just like, all right, I don't ever want to hear these songs again, except for, you have to learn them to play them live.
That's literally it. That is you're on the money right there. It's like the only time I really ever listen to our songs is to practice them for tour. So
yeah,
I can't tell you the last time I listened to Periphery 3 in its entirety. There's always like a window of like a couple weeks after we turn in the masters. And then maybe like I'll listen to it like once or twice, like once the album's officially out or once it's, out in the world. And I'll sort of put myself in the mindset, try to hear it like for the first time, try to pretend like I'm hearing it like for the first time. And then after that, I'm like, I'm good,
Yeah, it's like you wait until you get the CD and you're like, oh, cool, like I finally have it.
It's like it's real. It's a thing. It's real. Okay, cool. All right, on to the next,
Yeah, and then 2 months later, you're like, God, I wish I would have changed that one part on that one song, or
that part will never go away.
Yeah.
That's the perfectionist. I think we've accepted that, and we just, you just deal with it and move on.
The byproduct of being an artist.
Do it better next time,
Yeah. So you pretty much use Cubase a lot for a lot of your pre-production and writing. Have you always used Cubase, or did you ever use any other DAWs before that?
No. I've been all Steinberg from day one. Cubase was just what I started with. It makes the most sense. But I have to say, in hindsight, it's by far, like, I've used other DAWs, and it's by far the best for composition. Without a doubt, it has the best MIDI tools. And more important than anything else, it's, I know it, so it works with my workflow. There have been other very competent, like Nolly works in Logic. I think it's a very competent DAW, but I can't work in it. We tried to write stuff at his place, and it was just the workflow was making everything so slow to where it made me not want to be creative, because it was like we're spending more time just trying to figure it out than I was actually writing music. So, a DAW is like a language, it's some are better at other things, but ultimately you're going to be more comfortable with the one you know. So, use the one you know. And I know Cubase well enough to where I don't have to think about it. I can just, make the ideas happen.
Yeah, it's almost like an instrument or like an extension of you. It has to just be like, kind of like, playing an instrument. It's like if you don't really know how to get from point A to point B, or like, you're like, oh, I want to connect this scale and go up here, like, but I don't know how to do it. It's the same thing with they're like, I want to record a song and master it or mix it or whatever. But then you're like, you have to, like, once you know all that and it's just like a part of you,
yeah, you want it to be out of the way to some degree. I mean, as much as that doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement for DAWs, I think everyone would agree a good DAW is one that feels like it's out of the way. Like it's never in your way or impeding your progress when you're trying to be creative, Like that's probably one of the highest compliments you could pay to a good DAW.
Yeah, it's definitely a really personal thing. I use Cubase too. I used to use Logic. I had Logic Pro 9.
Right.
And then, when I started really getting into the film composer world and seeing a lot of composers who I liked using Cubase, I'm like, if Hans Zimmer uses it,
yeah,
it's got to be a pretty good DAW.
It is interesting that like composers have really latched onto this, because outside of that world, a lot of people use Pro Tools because it's like a very good engineering platform. Though I'd argue it's objectively not a great creative platform, and I think even Pro Tools fans would agree to that, And Logic is interesting because it seems to be somewhere in the middle. Like they really tried to be in the middle ground, and I think it's again, Nolly works in Logic and loves it, but I'm not faulting it, but I just found it very difficult to switch to. Though I do know quite a few people who've switched from Pro Tools to Cubase, interestingly enough. So there's something about it that is, I think, intuitive enough to where people will switch to it.
Yeah, I think when it comes to Pro Tools, it's been such an industry standard that people they think like, okay, I want to get I want to build a home studio and start recording. Oh, you get Pro Tools. Right. But nowadays things have changed so much, and like so many DAWs are really sort of trying to expand and make, like there's like Studio One.
Studio One kind of did the impossible, in my opinion. It's I when they came out, I was like, you're not going to start a new DAW. No one's going to start using a new DAW. Like that's ridiculous, And then they did it. I know a lot of people who use Studio One, and as I understand it, it's like a lot of ex-Steinberg guys who felt that like Cubase was maybe a bit bloated and a little bit too clunky. And I actually got a copy from someone at PreSonus. They were like, check this out, let me know what you think. And I thought it was really cool. It was just missing some sort of essential workflow features. Like one of the things I love about Cubase is the drum map. It makes my drum programming just literally 10 times faster than doing it in a piano roll. So now that's just the default. If I don't have that, I'm in trouble, And then things like with orchestral music, like having the expression maps, like that's a game changer. And I know you can get like you can buy plugins, or you can buy things that approximate those things in other DAWs, but like the fact that those are like just essential parts of Cubase, like it just seems like it was very composing oriented. Like they were always just catering to composers' wants and needs.
Speaking of the expression maps in Cubase, do you have any tips that you have that sort of speed up the process making expression maps? Because I've found for myself that
they take forever.
It takes forever, and you're just
they take forever. Actually, here's a tip, and I haven't even implemented this yet because I keep making expression maps and then like forgetting I made them, and then like just like I'm in a project and I'll just like, I'll just make one real quick, and then 30 minutes later it's made. It's like, that was a waste of time. I think I overcomplicate them. Like I think I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna need Colegno in this. And it's like, no, I'm not. Like, I think my rule that I'm gonna keep to myself is I'm gonna use expression maps for things I actually am gonna use. So like, I'll probably have legato, spiccato, and like, I don't know, maybe like if there's like a good tremolo or like or pizzicato, depending on the context, something like that. Things I'll actually switch between. Like honestly, my advice for that, we really think about what makes expression maps good, it'd be like any line that shares sort of legato and spiccato articulations.
Yeah.
Like if you're going like da 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 da, like normally you'd have to switch between the two tracks. So for something like that, it would be ideal, right? Because you could do it just in the same track and not have to awkwardly go between two tracks.
Yeah, and try to figure out the velocity for the other track and make it sound like it's seamless.
So I would almost say, like, if I was going to do expression maps in the future, rebuild them, I would actually probably just make it between legato and spiccato or something like that. I mean, obviously, like, that's like generalizing with strings right there, but like with horns, just have the articulations I'll actually use, you know? And that, more importantly, that you'd actually need to use in one continuous riff or motif or idea, because otherwise... You know, if it's just like, oh, this section now is going to be tremolo, then that's fine. I'll just switch to the other track for that, you know? And with the folders and Cubase, you can still keep everything neat. You know, the other advantage is like, oh, you don't have like a million tracks, but now, you know, I'm just saying, like, I think I overcomplicated it, but it is kind of a pain to set up. I'm not going to lie. It's like, I definitely spent entire days building that. And I think I have a video showing like my expression map setup I had at one point, which was just nuts. And there's one distinct disadvantage to the expression maps, which is sometimes just to the nature of like some string libraries, the legatos are a little bit soft in context. The attack is a little soft. So I'll layer it with the spiccatos, but then now you need another track anyways just for that, right?
Just for the spiccatos.
So like I think in that context, like I would probably just keep those expression maps very simple and then have a bunch of additional individual articulations for when I need those.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually. Because I think I kind of do the same thing. Like when you have, you know, a bunch of libraries that have all these multiple articulations, it's like your first thing is like, I want to have them all laid out. I want to be able to just, you know, when I want to use it.
Right.
But when you think about it, a lot of times when you start writing, you're like, well, I really don't use all these. So maybe I should just have a track of just that for when I do. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Does the middle of this motif need like super sol pont? You know, like, no, probably not. Yeah. I might never use that articulation ever, you know? So I don't need to be like, I don't need to like then make my expression map thing, you know, like I was like, oh, it's so small I can barely read what it is. It's like, no, it just needs to be like 2 or 3 things max. So there's my advice. And I haven't even taken advantage of that advice yet, but I will.
Yeah, unless you're some big time field composer and you know you have an assistant who can just sit there for a few days and just map all this stuff out.
Well, you know, I look at like the big composers. Like I remember like Tom Hulkenborg, is that how you say his name? Junkie XL, like was like, you know, he does a lot of videos showing his setup and his process, which I think is really cool. But a lot of these bigger guys will have like, you know, and obviously like Zimmer, but a lot of these composers who do a lot of work will sort of have that setup where they have every library loaded as tracks and then use Cubase's folder track to like make it not look like the complete mess that it is. And I'm guessing they're running like crazy, like, you know, slave setups for that. But like,
yeah, those dudes, it's insane what the setups that those guys have, like up like 5 or 6 slaves. Like I saw one of the videos with Junkie XL and he showed his back room and you just hear all these computers just running. He's like, all right, so I got this and this and this.
Right. It's like a server farm.
Yeah.
You
You're
know?
just like, you know, for all these like, you know, guys getting started that think, oh, that's what I need. No, like
it's amazing how little you need, really, you know, if you're trying to get something that's realistic. It's more fun to have like the crazy libraries and the specific libraries. And, you know, if you're going to do the detail work, it's great. But it is amazing, like how a lot of it, I think a lot of people will try to buy their way out of these problems. Like, oh, my composition sucks. Well, it's probably because I don't have like the Hans Zimmer server farm, like with all the slave computers, you know, and like 50 string libraries that I'm layering. Yeah. And you know, talking about layering, one thing that we did on Periphery 3, which was really good, is like, not for every section, but for the sections I'd say that were the sort of most obvious that they were kind of MIDI mock-ups, because some sections were better than others for a million different reasons, is then we just hired small sections. There's this guy who knows how to arrange this music, you know. Again, I don't know theory and I can't score this stuff, but I sent him the MIDI. And then he transcribed that into traditional sheet music and had like recorded these small sections playing those parts. And then we layered them over the top. They match perfectly, but they all also sound more unique and realistic, but it sounds like a larger section too, you know? So you use the libraries for the size, and you use the small sections to give it the added realism. And like that's almost a better way to spend money than trying to like layer 5-string libraries on top of each other and hope you have the computer power to run it. Yeah.
Yeah, especially because a lot of times so many different libraries have their own reverbs baked into it.
Right.
So it's kind of like people forget sometimes that you can sort of, use an ensemble, maybe divide it up between like first and second violins, violas, cellos, and all that, and then have some more drier libraries even later. And even if you're not even doing like a real string thing together, even if you're just using sample libraries, you can do stuff where you can sort of, have the more drier ones up front. So
right.
It sounds like you have that more individual, timbre of the instrument.
And that's what a lot of people do. I've done that as well. Like actually layer some of these libraries. It works pretty well. Like I know a lot of people use like LAS for that, because it's a very dry upfront in your face library, which isn't always what you want. But then if you mix it in with a fairly wet library, fairly wet string library, then it can sort of work together very nicely, So
yeah.
This is half the fun. This is why I have way too much software. I've spent way too much money on this crap.
Yeah, I feel your pain on that.
Yeah, man. Haven't we all? I bet everyone in this industry has.
Yeah, it's like you work, all this time, and then you see this new thing. You're like, oh man, that seems awesome. That's what I need to get, and you get it, and then there's some other thing that comes out, and you're just like, oh.
Yeah. This is very much the truth.
Yeah. Well, since you have so much cool stuff, and I know you've been experimenting with like analog synths and stuff. Is there any gear that you've been wanting to get, or that you feel that would be sort of important to your workflow, or things that you want to implement?
I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you. I am intellectually aware that I have way too much stuff already, and I have way more than what I need, without a doubt. Like I had more than what I needed when we did Periphery 3, and I have more gear now. So it's not a question of need; it's a question of want. In the world of wants, and I especially love when it's just people being creative, or there's new technology, or things are just getting refined. But there's also this big kick on analog synths right now, which I love. So now you're seeing a lot of cool options there. And there's this Deckard's Dream synth, which which I'm really considering spending a lot of money on. Have you heard about that?
No, I haven't actually heard
I think
of that
it's like a CS80 tribute. Like it's not even an emulation. It's this crazy analog synth. I think it's made in Japan, and I think it costs like $4,000, and it just sounds like Blade Runner the synth, and it's and it's just so sick, and I really, really don't need it, and I really, really want it. So yeah,
those analog synths can get pretty expensive. It's like, I mean, because VST synths are cool, but there's just something about, I think, analog synths that just
there is. I just did an electronic album with Jake from my band. And I have a fair bit of analog synths already. Like I have a Moog Sub 37, a Moog Minotaur, a Sequential Prophet 6, Korg Minilog, and I was using those so much with pedals and with with Axe effects and or just the effects in the DAW or whatever. But
yeah,
the way those things sound and fit in the mix is insane. I was using a lot of software synths too, so it's a mix of both. The thing about the software synths is you can do anything. Like they're so easy, like get any sound out of it, right? Yeah. But it requires a bit of work and finessing to get it to sit well, to sort of get what you want. These analog synths, especially of this caliber, there's just something about how they sit in a mix that is effortless. Like sometimes I forget to EQ them, because it just works. And I say forget because I always generally try to, high pass filter a little bit, just because those things get out of control. But like I'll literally forget to with the software synths, I'll need to do some work. It just needs a bit of work to help it sit the way I want it to. And the analog stuff it's just magical. So it's not that you can't get good results out of digital synths, and I love them, I really do. But there's something about an analog hardware analog synth that just is magical in how it just works. You know?
Yeah, especially when you layer it, like layering it with guitars, as soon as when I started doing some recording stuff, and because I'm a big Dream Theater fan, and I've always loved the sound of rhythm or like lead guitars layered with synths. It just adds this other, I don't know, just harmonics to it that just sounds.
Dude, you aren't kidding, because I actually discovered that kind of by accident. So the whole fall in love with synths thing was around the time we started Periphery 3. Maybe it was because I was just like, I need something else to be into. So the orchestral libraries were one thing that was like, wow, this whole new world. And I was like, you know what? I'm fascinated by synthesis, and I want to kind of learn it. So I'm gonna get a good analog synth. I got a Moog Sub 37 because I was like, it seems like that synth is very hard to make sound bad. So it'll be encouraging, but it'll also teach me about synthesis. And I just got it just to learn. And I'll tell you, man, that synth is probably on every track of that album. Sometimes in places you wouldn't even realize, because what I realized is like if I double a line with the Sub 37, like a guitar line or a lead line or whatever, you might not even hear the synth, but it just does something magical to the sound and the tone of it. Like it just sat so perfectly. And it was one of those things everyone's hearing, like, I'd like program in the line to match the guitar, and everyone would be like, yep, yeah, yes, definitely.
Yeah, you take it out and you're just like, nah, put it back.
Yeah, put it back in. Exactly. Because I try not to be like too gratuitous with that stuff. Like, oh, I got a piece of gear, therefore I have to use it. It was more out of curiosity, and everyone was like, yeah, no, that is better. And then eventually it was this kind of thing like, hey, put the Moog on there, Let's see what that sounds like. So I agree completely with guitars, like a good analog synth. My God, it just works. Just sounds so good. I'll be abusing the crap out of that on the new album, without a doubt.
Hell yeah. So with all the cool stuff that you've been a part of, and all the awesome things and opportunities you've been able to do, is there anything that you haven't done that you sort of want to do, or
relative to music?
Anything, or just like like business wise, or with music.
Personal goal is to get my pilot's license someday when I have time and money to do that, but and be better at driving cars around a track. But aside from that, I'd say I feel like I've been slowly chipping away at this. I haven't really taken a good sort of stab at it, but like I'd love to compose for video games or for movies someday. But it's a very tough industry. I'm realistic. Like it's a very tough industry to break into, It's one of those things where people will go to the guys that they go to, and for good reason, because why take a chance on someone new when you got something that works, and in those cases you really can't afford to have those things not work. So it's a tough industry without a doubt, but it's something that I hope to slowly break into, because I've had a little taste of it, and it's been really fun when I have.
So have you actually done any composing for anything before? Or?
So I contributed 2 songs to the Halo 2 reissue, the anniversary reissue, which was fun. And
that's awesome.
I did a song for the end credits of the Deus Ex, the Mankind Divided game. Just an end credits thing, which was just fun. That was like pretty open to interpretation, but I had fun with that. And I actually I was a big Destiny fan, and I did like this metal cover of like one of the sort of strike bosses, because I just liked that song a lot. And again, it was an exercise in like trying to pick out every part, because it's very orchestral. Trying to pick out every part in the orchestra to see if I can like replicate it on guitar to some degree. But the composer actually heard that and liked it, and then they ended up using it as a placeholder for like this DLC that came out. And then they ended up doing, just as luck would happen, they did a revamped version of that strike, which was that whole update was a lot more metal. Like literally, I think it was for Rise of Iron, so like the metal is like a big theme there. So it's just one of those things that worked out very, very interestingly, and they ended up using that as the song. And like this was just good luck on my part, but I did a 1-to-1 copy of the song, so like it was the same tempo, same everything. So they could literally take the track and sequence it in the exact same way. So it would loop and end and start exactly as the orchestral one did. So for them, it was like super easy. And they're like, hey, can we license
throw
this?
it in.
Yeah, and throw it in. I was like, yeah, of course. That'd be great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I think you could totally do it. I mean, from what I've seen of the orchestral stuff that you've done, and just your knack for writing, I think you could totally do it.
I think it would be a challenge. Like, I don't think it would be something that I could just. But I think the challenge would be what would force me to get better in a way that would be difficult if I didn't have that on my plate, But it's a challenge that I think would be a lot of fun, like that I'd really want to take seriously. I just need the opportunity. I need to find something that makes sense. And it's also something that, to be quite honest with you, it's like at this point in my life, like, something comes, like I'll do it, but I'm not chasing it because I have so many things on my plate already that, like, if I got like a thing where I had to score a game or something, it would be a pretty big commitment and other things would have to get kind of pushed to the side. So I don't even mind if this is something that sort of slowly develops now and that eventually, materializes down the road when I can dedicate a bit more time to it. But that is something that, yeah, long term, I would love to be something I do.
Like, same for me. I'm just like, man, the band stuff's cool, but man, it'd be really cool to score a video game. I don't know. For me, I think video games would probably be more of something I would want to do.
Agreed.
Than, because film scoring, I mean, that I love listening to film scores, but something about video game scores, I think there's just a more of a freeingness.
I think a lot of video game scores. I think the goal of a video game score is very different. Like in a movie, and I don't know if this is just a sign of the times. This is a matter. It's been a matter of debate, but I feel like a lot of times the job of scoring a movie for a lot of movies is to kind of be out of the way. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's kind of to be a bed for the movie to sit on, but not like, ideally you shouldn't even notice that it's there, right? Whereas in a video game, it's a lot of times the driving force, Mm-hmm. And it means that you get more adventurous with your motifs and with what's going on musically, and it's a lot more memorable. Like, Final Fantasy, like Final Fantasy 7, like that music will always be important to me. That music makes me feel feelings. Same for 8, same for 10, like those games were games that I loved. And by extension, you hear the music so much. God, I just played Persona 5. Like, God, that soundtrack is incredible, That's why I walk away. Like, the game was incredible, but that soundtrack was also incredible. Like, that feeling is amazing. So I agree with you. I think scoring for video game would be something that would probably be more not only relevant to my interests but appropriate to my talents.
Yeah, because it seems like there's a lot more of creative freedom,
right?
Versus a film score. It's like, okay, here's the picture. This cue starts from here to here. It has to end. And then it's like, okay, now you have to fit for what you're seeing. Making it all sound. Yeah, like one thing, like you're saying, like bringing out that emotional aspect of it and not really being like at the forefront. It's really easy to know what a good score is. And you ever have that where you watch a movie and when it's bad? You're just like, this music is horrible. Like, what are they doing? I don't.
I just feel totally like I jumps that out. Less. I feel like I notice that less when the music's bad. I just tune it out. But when it's good, I'm like, damn, this music is good. And I feel like that's not that common these days. Like, to where I actually notice that the music is good, Yeah, there's actually some times where I've heard film scores and not even seen the movie, and it made me want to watch the movie because I was just like, damn, this score is so good. Like Benjamin Wallfish, his score for A Cure for Wellness is just one of my favorite scores. Oh, ever. I never saw that. Never saw that.
Just listen to the music. Even if, if you get to see the movie, it totally works. But like when I've listened to the score probably, I don't know, 50 times or more, and it's just so dark and just like beautiful but haunting at the same time. And that's the kind of stuff I even like, when it comes to my own music. It's just I've always kind of gravitated to the more like darker sounds. Yeah. And just the way he orchestrates, like he can do the whimsical stuff, but when it comes to like the horror stuff, he can make it really scary, but at the same time just like these beautiful melodies that are just haunting. And it works really well with, like, when I finally saw the movie, I was just like, okay, yeah, it made it that much better.
Wow, noted. I'm gonna have to check that out then.
I guess getting onto some of the more business stuff again, I guess there's been some interviews where you've talked about, having multiple income streams, with the band, and, because sometimes I think a lot of people, there's a misconception of like what bands, do when it comes to like making a living. Is there any suggestions that you would have for like more smaller time musicians that are, trying to pursue their band that might be curious in exploring other aspects of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like I've caught a little bit of flack because people, misinterpreted what I was saying, because like some websites like reposted an interview and made it look like I was complaining, which is kind of annoying. But yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of opportunity in this industry. I think if you're at a smaller level, like we used to give guitar lessons on the road, our drummer Matt to this day still does. Mm-hmm. Just be creative with it. I know some bands where like the band members or some of the band members actually manage other bands. And then other than that, it may be more traditional stuff. It means that like you might still have to have a job when you get home. A lot of bands have that, more than you'd realize. And I think there's people who think out there that like, oh, if you get to a certain size, that wouldn't be the case. But if we didn't have these other income streams, like I would have to get a job when I'm home from tour. Yeah. So that's what it is. Is just sort of managing your expectations, because people are like, oh, well, maybe, I get questions sometimes. It's like, well, it's not that I want to be a rock star or make a living or care too much about being rich from music. If I could just clear like $60K a year from music, that would be great. And I'm like, dude, like that will be really impossible just off the band, off band income and touring. Like you'd have to have a very lucky and, maybe a long career before you'll get to that point. And it's not something that you can count on. You're going to have to do stuff in the meantime. Most likely, unless you win the lottery and your band blows up, it's going to take you years.
Yeah.
Years and years and years of hustling. And in that meantime, you're not going to have a job, and you need to find other ways. So, everything from like having a job when you come home from tour that's flexible. So a lot of people do serving jobs, bartending, things like that, to, giving lessons, Skype lessons when you can, or start in my case, starting businesses. If you have the opportunity for signature products, chase those up. It's kind of different for every band and the experience. Like, for example, we are not a big merch band. We can't sell that much merch. It's just not our scene. So there's bands that are smaller than us, especially like scene bands, like that can just crush it in merch, and then they can walk home with more money, and that's great for them. But what we have is we have the opportunity to influence. We're influencers when it comes to gear and things like that. And that's something that I parlayed into signature deals and into starting businesses. So it's sort of just recognizing, all right, what can I hit with this? And how can I translate that into something that will allow me to make some extra income? Passive income, ideally, but extra income one way or another. Because the band itself most likely will not allow you to survive.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to approach everything else in your career just as creatively as the music. I think some people, like, they focus so hard on the music, and they're like, this is it. Like, this is the best thing I've ever done. Everyone should love it. And then when they go out there and they tour and they don't realize how hard it is and how, like, I don't want to sleep on anyone's floor on the tour. Like, well, you're going to have to, because we're not making enough money to get a hotel or sleeping in your van.
Well, I mean, that's at
Walmart,
first. That's at first. But even eventually, you might be fine with that. But just because you're sleeping on a floor doesn't mean that you're walking home with money,
Well, Misha, I just want to thank you for your time and taking this interview with me. I think, you've offered a lot of really cool information in regards to your gear and how you approach your businesses and all that. And I just want to say thank you and good luck on the new Periphery album and everything else that you work on. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of cool things coming out in the future.
Yeah, hopefully, right? It should be a fun year. I'm trying to keep it that way. But thank you very much for the interview, man.